Welcome everyone to our third episode of the Prime Barrel Chronicles, where we talk to people behind the whiskey. We do want to showcase the entire grain to glass process, as we call it, and really highlight the laborious process that it takes to make a good tasting whiskey. And today we're joined by Colin and Jen from Kings County Distillery. It's a distillery that near and dear to our hearts, being that they are in our proverbial and literal, backyard. We both from Brooklyn, New York. You guys are actually located in the historical, Brooklyn Navy Yard in the Playmaster building. I had to actually look up what it was famous for, and according to my research, it was actually a bank to military and just regular citizens during that time. I think it was built in like 1899. Correct me if I'm wrong. But let's start there.
Yep.
How did you guys, ended up in that building? That's as good of a first question as any.
Yeah. So Kings County started in 2010, and we actually started in a little one-room studio in East Williamsburg, and weren't entirely sure that the idea would. Craft distilleries have become very common now, but there was a time where it was entirely possible that people would be very skeptical of sort of homemade spirits or small scale spirits without the sort of presumed infrastructure that a corporate spirits company has in place to ensure that you don't go blind and you don't go, make stuff that makes you go crazy. So, right. So, but after a couple of years of doing it, it was clear the idea was going to take off. So, and got interested in the Brooklyn Navy Yard kind of on a whim, as the Navy Yard actually kind of recruited us as tenants. The Brooklyn Navy Yard is owned by the city and managed by the city as a kind of small business incubator. So they're looking for businesses that are diverse, that have a little bit of a story, that are building manufacturing jobs, which many cities are losing. So, there's an element of sort of civic pride that came along with the move to the Navy Yard. And also just for a whiskey company that didn't have a history, to be able to be in the proximity of the historic distilling district of Brooklyn, which was centered around the neighborhood of Vinegar Hill on the west side of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is where we are located. So it was kind of the convergence of a lot of different factors that made the Paymaster building so appealing as a distillery. And of course, now we have 5 other locations in terms of three more aging warehouses, and then a tasting room and an event space. So, but all the whiskey is still made in the Paymaster building.
And that's very interesting. And I think the building itself now became a destination of sorts, where people that actually love and enjoy whiskey now make it a point of actually come visiting you, which wasn't really available in your early days. Let's actually talk about your early days, because I think that's where our relationship began. And for the people that are watching this, they kind of know that the Prime Barrel Club is, we source barrels from several retail accounts around New York City, but I mean, the 2 that are the most prominent ones are the Wine Spot and then also the Grain and Wine. And I remember when the Grain and Wine shop was opened, it was back in 2014. One of the very first bourbon products that we got into the shop was your product. And I remember those little flasks, seeing them for the first time. And I'm like, well, that's new. I've never seen anything like this before. And it perfectly fit the demographic. It perfectly fit the neighborhood. And it was just a marriage made in heaven. And speaking about that, how did you guys end up with those flasks? Because those are now, I don't want to call them iconic, but they are easily recognizable. Yeah. Right. And so when people see that, oh yeah, I know what this is. So how did you guys land it on that?
I mean, originally when we got started, it was just that we really didn't make that much. And so when we were making moonshine for our first 2 years, this is really, we made like 12 of these a day. And it's crazy to think of now, but it was a way to sort of truthfully convey that we are a much smaller, very different kind of business than I think what people were used to and what people understood alcohol to be at that point. So so it was and the flask, you know, sort of works in a portable. I mean, New York City people sort of travel on foot, and you know, it's
100%.
kind of it just
100%.
sort of suited the landscape at the time, and you know, we've kind of clung to it now. Obviously, we have the full size 750 bottles, but I was reluctant to do that just because so much of our core audience in New York City really preferred the smaller packaging. And again, it was a way to differentiate
popular
us.
to take to the park, popular to take to the sneak into the movies and do any of those things that New Yorkers love to do.
Which speaks to your bootlegging beginnings, I guess, or moonshining beginnings of distilling, you know, the whiskey in your apartment. I think most people that are familiar with your brand and your distillery kind of know the story that, you know, you've started doing it in your apartment, and then quickly realize, hey, I kind of want to be on a right side of the law. And so that's how a distillery was born, right? And so again, but what most people don't realize is that you are not a distiller by trade. You're actually a Yale educated architect. So talk to me about how the Yale educated architect ends up in a whiskey business. And not just that, you have, or perhaps had, a partner. I'm not sure if partnership's still alive and kicking, but so he is a magazine editor. So how these two worlds that, you know, seemingly have no overlap.
Right. I don't know that I have a good answer to that question. Just sort of strange fate is, I mean, I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, and that is certainly the moonshine part of Kentucky. So there was always a part of me, like many people who move to New York, you become sort of fascinated in a strange way with the culture that you had come from. And so I began to sort of re-examine Appalachian moonshine in that sort of New York City context. And the farm to table movement was happening in food, and the craft cocktail movement. So there were a lot of things that made it sort of an interesting time to kind of reconsider what a hobby distiller is, what a moonshiner is. And so in a I don't know if it was an intellectual way or an ironic way, or just a sort of like, this seems like kind of a fun thing to do kind of way, got a still off the internet and just became curious with how I could sort of be a, you know, a home distiller, a hobby, not a hobby distiller is maybe the wrong word, but just kind of as there are home brewers, could I end up making moonshine? And because you can't really do that legally, it did sort of push David and myself. David is my business partner and roommate, both in New York and then previously in college. And he was sort of entrepreneurial and I was entrepreneurial, and we thought, maybe let's just take this moonshine idea and turn it into a business. And once you start thinking about making unaged whiskey distillate, which is moonshine, immediately you're sort of begin to think about aging it, which is something that hobby distillers can't do very well. They just don't, you can't do it on a scale that makes it practical to age it.
Right.
So it was a little bit like, oh, actually, this could be really fun.
So once you pass that point where, okay, it became more than just a hobby, right? Now the business side of things gets into the picture. And as such, if you're making whiskey and you're not located in a whiskey mecca of United States, which is Kentucky and then, you know, surrounding territories, Tennessee, Indiana. I actually remember there is a very well-known commercial, old commercial. What's commercial? I think you know what I'm referring to, but it's basically people from Middle West, and they drinking some bourbon, and it says like New York on a label, and they're like, New York, almost like dismissive of the fact. Did you guys like worry at all about the marketing component of it? Like how the hell I'm going to sell a moonshine and then a fairly young whiskey, not from Kentucky and out of all places in New York?
I believe the commercial was Pace Picante sauce.
Cookie. Pace Picante sauce is made in San Antonio with fresh vegetables and spices by people who know what picante sauce is supposed to taste like.
This stuff's made in New York City?
New York City?
Get a rope.
I mean, in the beginning, that was definitely something we faced a lot of pushback with this idea that bourbon, not just could only come from Kentucky or should only come from Kentucky. But I think, there's so many craft distillers that have opened in the last 10 years. And so many distillers have opened in Kentucky that have actually demonstrated a real point of differentiation with the kind of commercial. I don't know that many people realize how commercialized and how commoditized the bourbon industry had become, even as a bunch of people began to discover it, become enthusiastic about it and infatuated with it. There really was not that much variety or, arguably all that much. People wanted to believe in this sort of handmade family tradition of producing that just was long gone from Kentucky. So I think many craft distillers around the country have kind of opened up different regionalizations that could happen within American whiskey, and have pointed out maybe that even within Kentucky, there are different ways of producing bourbon, some of which are more credible than some of the stuff that people got excited about, 10, 15 years ago.
People are attracted to novelty too. I think eventually, if you're a collector, if you're a connoisseur, if you're into fine wines and spirits, eventually you want to drink around and diversify. And there's an appeal to people who are kind of marching to their own beat because you want to try something new, because it's kind of a mental, a sensory game too. So people are excited by people who are doing something different or incorporating global techniques or, whatever it is. Cask finishes in American whiskey, so all of those things have their appeal. And there's more sort of connoisseurship variety now than there definitely was 10, 15 years ago.
100%. From the business standpoint, I can tell you this much, and I don't know what your guys' take is on this, but as a retailer, as a club curator, we always want to do interesting things, not just go bourbon rye. And so that's where the finishes come on, and even the finishes, they have been a little bit overdone, if you ask me, over the last year or two. And so people are clamoring for something even more exotic, such as rums, tequilas. The problem with that is that not enough people will be actually willing to take that leap when it comes time to put their money where their mouths are. And it makes it super hard to make it a sustainable business. So, and the reason I'm talking about this is that I know you guys were on the forefront even before this crazy finishing bourbon boom began a few years ago. You guys were always producing interesting whiskey, like I chocolate malt, I think it was, or bourbon. I can't recall what it was, but you guys were the first bourbon that I've tried that had a chocolate flavor to it, and then jalapeno, all those things. So it speaks to what Jen just said, where novelty is only as good if the juice is good, and if it's just the novelty component, it's not sustainable. But if the end product is actually good and it's worth its salt, then it actually works. One of the things you guys also are kind of known for is small yields. And I'm talking as a curator of a single barrel club. Your barrels sell out within a day. We actually launched a barrel of yours, the 5th or 6th barrel we picked with you, and it sold out in the first day, which we're thankful for our members. And that also speaks to how far you guys came. It's a 7.5-year juice. You've known for smaller barrels, like 30-gallon barrels. That's how you guys distill and keep the bourbon. Was it just a spacing issue? How did you guys landed on 30 gallons versus full 53 gallons?
Well, it's actually been a progression over time. And in the days when we were just making these little tiny flasks, we would do 5-gallon, and we did those for about 2 years. Then we moved up to 10-gallon, then we moved up to 15. Interestingly, this barrel that we're talking about is one of the first 30-gallon barrels that we did, way back, this again 7.5 years ago. And now the only barrels that we're filling are 30s and 53s, and really the majority is 53-gallon barrels. So it was in part a way to have, small barrels. There's a lot of debate about what they, are they effective? Are they good? Are they, but from my point of view, if I knew we wanted to release a 1-year-old whiskey, and if we're going to release a 1-year-old whiskey, it's never going to, from my point of view, it's never going to be good out of a 53. And
Right.
the best hope of producing something palatable is to use a smaller format barrel. And that has basically been true as we've, the larger barrels hold up to longer aging, and that's where most of the longer age whiskeys that we have are really barrels that we filled at the same time that we were doing those 10s and 15s. We just knew that they would end up on a longer cycle. So even though Kings County is maybe known for the small barrels, that may just be because that was the leading edge of the iceberg or the glacier of the aging whiskey that we have coming.
I had a conversation with Ryan Chickta, who's our head blender and distillery manager, about there's a distillery exclusive that we made with Marianne Eves, which was also sort of a blend across barrel sizes. There's an interest, I know, to sort of maintain it's not just about upscaling to the 53s and then trying to do everything just like Kentucky. I know there's an interest, at least within the blending team, of incorporating some sort of smaller size, whether it's 30s or whatever, in order to maintain the sort of distillery character. And then it's just a different artistic challenge of maintaining that sort of, when you try Kings County, it's always Kings County, it's there, but there's a small batch integrity, but then also trying to upscale to like larger sizes. But it feels to me, the more conversations I have with the guys, that blending across sizes is still going to be really important, even though, organically, I think, predating my time when we began using smaller casks, that wasn't a premeditated goal, but now it's something that we're incorporating into the current character.
We've actually backtracked a little bit on it because I assumed we would just go up and up and up in size. And we've actually gone back and have been backfilling 30-gallon barrels in order to keep the flavor profile and keep what Jen is talking about, which is just that it actually is easier to pull from when you have more flavor notes to pull from. So really creating that diversity within the warehouse from which then the blenders can assemble the different whiskeys. So for us, it really is about creating a diverse palette of available whiskeys from which you can then assemble different kinds of whiskey from that. And that's very much a sort of Scotch whiskey production, approach, not necessarily an American approach where you just fill 53s and then they turn their age statement and you pull it out and it's ready to go and put it in the bottle.
We're fortunate to have a blending team, like a pretty bespoke blending team. Like they're sort of our de facto distillery managers, but we have a old school dedicated team of blenders, which is something that we sort of do at a higher level than some of our other craft distilleries in the area. So it's definitely something that's like an appeal to the brand. But
a lot of people sometimes interchangeably use two terms, maturation and aging. And those two things are not the same. Like the aging is aging, like you can't change time, right? So like 4 years are 4 years, but in a smaller cask, I think most people refer to as maturation. Like the flavor profile is a lot more rich if it comes from the smaller vessel, because the contraction and all of that movement within the cask is amplified when it's smaller. Obviously, there's less area to cover, so to speak, right?
Right.
Speaking of what Jen just mentioned about the bespoke blending, not a lot, but a few, even local brands now start to offer a bespoke blending programs. Meaning, like I know you guys do obviously single barrel program, but this is almost as an extension of that. Have you guys thought about doing something like that, or this is not where focus is?
It's about bandwidth.
Yeah. It sounds
Always
fun to
is.
us, but we are truthfully the sort of the sales side of the business, or at least in this moment, we represent the sales side of the business, which sounds great and would be very fun to do. But on the other hand, there's the practical means of pulling that together and trying to execute it on the scale.
Right.
Of course.
And you know, even single barrels have become so coveted. You know, the fact that we're even able to sell a single barrel as a kind of outside of the Kings County normal program already, I think is about as far as we can go, given the general demand on American whiskey and just the infrastructure that we have, the team that we have to do all the things that we're trying to do.
And you know what? I mean, I know this as well as anyone. Jen and I have been to battles, trying to source the barrel, her trying to tell us, no, we don't have enough juice to even do our core SKU. I get all that. So, all right, that's fine. That's a good segue, actually. So we talked about your beginnings. We kind of talked about your, road to where you currently are. What's the future like for Kings County? Where do you guys, like, do you see yourself aging barrels, I don't want to say forever, but like getting to 15, 20 or points, or is it never going to come? And not just from the aging standpoint, what other, cool and interesting things you guys are thinking about doing in the future?
Right. Well, I think if we began the distillery by sort of looking to sort of American tradition and moonshine and bourbon, I think as we have evolved as a company and we've brought in more people with a more diverse perspective, we have aimed our whiskeys more at an international audience, pulling a lot of techniques from Scotch whiskey, a lot of techniques from playing around with Irish whiskeys, really kind of looking beyond American bourbon to create a more broad profile of American whiskeys. And so I think if we hold any position within the landscape of American whiskey, it's my hope that we hold the sort of most international perspective of American distillers, in the sense that we look to other traditions and other processes for ways that we can always make excellent, great whiskey, but maybe we're not necessarily doing it precisely the same way that they do it in Kentucky, but we tweak it in this way or this way or this way.
So to our geography, right? Because New York is a global community by nature. We sort of are situated in a transatlantic area. To be a New Yorker is to incorporate styles of fashion, drink.
The ages of the whiskey that's coming. I mean, we are not a distillery that makes a lot of compromises. So I think you can expect in the future, we aim to make the world's best whiskey. We've always said that, but there was a time where that sounded like completely hubristic and it's just preposterous to say. But we do, go in every day to make the absolute best that can be made. And I think, it may take us a decade to get to the point where we have stuff that's comparable to the great whiskeys of the world. But I mean, we've been around for 12 years. Another 10 is not that far off. So
I'm actually curious to know how long those, like with age statements in American whiskey, when you're dealing with new wood and generally hot climates and things in Kentucky, the sort of emphasis on like a Pappy style 18-year-old plus age statement is actually important to remember. That's really unusual. It's really unusual for a whiskey to last that long in a cask and still taste great. In New York, I think there's an interesting question as we go into 53s, what is a New York climate 53-gallon barrel? Like, what's the lifespan of that cask? And I don't know if we know. We're not going to really find out until you pop it in a cask and see how long it goes. So, there might be some potential for some higher age statement stuff, but it's about, I don't want to, like, to Colin's point, it's about making something that's great. And if I don't think there's an idea that we're going to push it to 18 years just to do sort of an older age statement just because of it. But if it's like a natural emanation of the climate or something, then maybe, because, we don't do heat cycling in the warehouses. We're working with all 4 seasons. We have really hot summers, really cold winters, and which makes us inherently different aging environment than other, Kentucky, Tennessee, etc. So correct. I guess we'll find out.
All right, let me throw a curveball at you. I know behind the scenes we spoke about a few things that are happening within an industry that most people don't necessarily associate with an industry. What I'm talking about is the crypto. And I know the marketplace right now is probably in a worst place ever to be talking about it. But I'm just kind of curious, what is your outlook on how this industry overall can evolve into in that space, and if there's anything that KCD is doing or perhaps thinking about doing in the space?
Well, it is an interesting comparison. I mean, whiskey has always been an alternative to currency in a certain sense, because it does appreciate over time, and it's one of the few commodities on earth that go up in value the longer they sit. So that has made it, I think, very interesting to sort of speculation, and just the relationship of the digital to the consumable, I think, is always where where it either works or doesn't work. I mean, we would be happy to continue to think about ways to make that work, and I'm interested in maybe you sell futures on a barrel that we fill today, and then you come back in 10 years. The difficulty for us is then everybody wants to age it forever, and so then you're stuck with a barrel that goes on with nobody ever willing to sort of pull it out of inventory, because there's just
and there's a lot of there's no guarantee
that
that specific barrel is going to come out great,
yeah,
because there's so much nature and chaos and randomness and influences that even people with very large labs at very large companies are still trying to crack, that you can't necessarily guarantee the outcome of what that one particular barrel will going to be. And there's an element of whiskey that is sort of akin to art, in that there's a value to it that is cultural and emotional, that people will pay what they want to pay for it. So I think like that's kind of an obvious link, and then which is sort of a timeless element of any artistic anything, whether it's painting or a wine or whatever, and then finding ways to link this very sort of timeless old school thing into, say, the crypto environment. Like I think there are definitely ways to do it without sort of sacrificing the integrity of doing something slowly, so to speak. But I guess we'll find out, because the crypto landscape is evolving by the day.
Yes, it is. Like anything else, and there are different use cases for crypto, right? And depending on who you talk to, people either love it or hate it. Like there's a swamp of people that don't even know enough about it to render an opinion about it. And so there's a huge deal of education that needs to take place. But once you overcome that initial step, then you start dissecting what the potential use cases for the crypto or specifically NFTs are, right? And so for the brand, it might look a little bit different than what it might look for us as a club, right? Or as a retailer. I can tell you this much from experience and talking to many different brands on the topic. Majority of them are either actively pursuing something in the space or actively researching something in this space, because in 5 years from now, they don't want to be in a position to kind of miss the boat and then have to explain to their powers that be what had exactly happened and why they didn't have a strategy. And it's fine if it's not for them. It's totally fine. Like I've spoken to the brands that said, hey, the entire brand was built on the history of whiskey making and bourbon, and we're not really on the forefront of digital space. Like we don't want to be there, and that's fine. That's totally fair. And then others say, well, you know what? Everything's evolving, and we at least want to understand the space, and then perhaps see how can we apply the new technology towards scaling of our brand and our business. So, like, I'll give you a specific example. For the brand, the playbook could be, hey, we have 5 different SKUs, right? Regular SKUs that we output. And then, once a year, we have the special release that everyone wants. Well, if you buy our 5 SKUs, you get an NFT. And then when we actually put that special release out, if you're an NFT holder, it's only available to them. So that's a playbook that a lot of brands are kind of trying to explore further when we talk about NFTs. But anyway, as you guys know, we're working on an NFT program ourselves, and I'm really interested to see how it all going to turn out. All right, I've taken up a lot of your time. I guess two last questions that I have for you. Outside of whiskey, and it's, again, we're doing this for the people to get to know you a little better, right? So outside of whiskey, what are your hobbies? What do you do outside? How do you decompress, and what do you love to do?
Yeah. I mean, if whiskey is my first love in life, it's not my first love in life because I only was like 21 when I first, of course, drank whiskey. But movies, I'm really into movies, and so I could go now that people are going to the movies again. I went to Top Gun. I have to say, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of pent up. For people who like to go to the movies, that was a lot of fun to go back and get into that. So I don't know, Jen may have the same answer. I don't know.
That is the same answer. I mean, I'm an actor by trade before I worked in fine spirits, and it's kind of like, for me, it's like Francis Ford Coppola has said, I believe, that he doesn't consider wine or movies to be one or the other. Like, they're both sort of equal passions, and I would say that's the same for me. It's fortunate that you can make money in one industry when the other one is struggling because whatever. So that's handy. But like, not only making them, but going to see them and enjoying them and loving them, and music as well. Like been partying in the city for 20 years and saw electronic music arrive, and I still really love it. And going dancing in New York is like one of my favorite nightlife experiences, which is also
it's the city like no other.
Yeah.
I grew up in Philly, but then between the golden age for a guy, and Colin, you might agree or disagree, but between 25 and 35, that is like the golden era for any guy. I spent it in New York, and so I have a unbridled love for the city. And every time I come back, I moved to Los Angeles now, and that's where my family is. And I come back to New York often, but every time I do, it's like you get this rush of energy that you can't get any other place. Like I just haven't found it. Favorite movie, real quick. What's your favorite movie?
Oh God.
I know it's like asking like what's your favorite color, but still, I'll go first. My favorite movie is Pulp Fiction. That's the movie.
Yeah.
Well, actually, there's two: Pulp Fiction and My Cousin Vinny. Those two.
Yeah.
Every time that comes on, I can watch it, and even though I just
rewatched My Cousin Vinny.
Yeah,
it is.
My Cousin Vinny's in my top 5. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a very well-made movie. I'll say for this, at this particular moment in this headspace, Casablanca. I like old movies. They just were made in a different way, and that's a very beautiful movie that would be hard pressed to get a movie like that made today. And
that's when people actually cared about acting. Yes, I totally agree. All right, guys. I appreciate your time. I told you it's going to be short. We went over a little bit, but it's okay. Thank you for joining. In terms of our barrels, I already told Jen, it's gone. It's sold out in the first day. It's a testament to you as a brand that people are flocking to Kings County releases. And as you guys are growing older in age, and again, like 7.5 in a 30-gallon cask doesn't really drink like 7.5, right? It drinks a lot older, but a lot more refined as well. And so people on Discord are welcome to leave their reviews. We actually have a place for them to do so. So we'll see how that turns out. We love the pick. Thank you for making it available to us. And thanks for your time today. I appreciate it. Hopefully we can do it again